So we are now at the official beginning of the seminar, and I'm delighted to welcome now 288 participants to this discussion organized by the Political Science Department at University College London. As you know, we're going to be discussing the confrontation between Russia and Ukraine. We may be looking at Europe's biggest security crisis since the Second World War. I'm Roderic Lyne. I was ambassador to Russia during President Putin's first term, and I'm very fortunate to be joined by three eminent experts in a four-cornered ring. In the military corner, and going to speak first, we have General Sir Adrian Bradshaw, who was the commander of the British Army's land forces in 2013, and then the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe at NATO from 2014 to 2017. He took up that post just after the Russian invasion of Crimea and the start of Russia's conflict with Ukraine. I shall speak second, and I will try to take a look at the Kremlin's objectives. Speaking third in the Ukrainian corner, we are delighted to have Orysia Lutsevych, who has recently been in Kiev. Orysia is an independent member of the research staff at Chatham House and is the manager of the Chatham House Ukraine Forum. Finally, from the United States, joining us from San Jose in California, where it is 10 o'clock in the morning, will be Steven Pifer. Steve was the US ambassador to Ukraine from 1998 to 2000, having previously served in Moscow and on the National Security Council staff in Washington. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the William Perry Fellow at Stanford University, and he has published extensively on this subject. Steve unfortunately has to leave us shortly before 7 p.m. to go to yet another seminar. If there are any questions specifically for him, we'll see if we can squeeze them in first, but I warn you that Steve may not be around for the Q&A part of this seminar. It's very kind of him to make the time for us. Each of us are going to speak for about 5 minutes in our introductory remarks. We will then have a panel discussion for about 20 minutes before concluding with questions from the audience. So at this point, I am going to turn the microphone over to General Sir Adrian Bradshaw. I'm allowing him time to unmute himself. And Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roderic, very much indeed. Well, I've got very little time to cover four questions: Russian options, the likely Ukrainian response, and might Russia use force elsewhere, and what the NATO response might be. But before I address any of those, a senior military commander has to consider what motivates the opposition, and in particular, the person at the top. And if I consider the political and military strategic objectives of Mr. Putin, number one is to keep Mr. Putin in power. So his main target, actually, of everyone, is his own population. Very important to keep that in mind. His second objective, and it's a parallel objective, is, I believe, to increase the Russian sphere of influence, to recreate part of the old Soviet empire, if you like, to rebuild some of the former status of the Soviet Union for Russia, which is sorely missed by him, to create something of a security buffer zone and thus enhance, in his view, the real security of Russia. And that's a reverse loop because, of course, in achieving the second objective, he enhances success of the first. So the Russian options, I think, boil down to roughly negotiate the best offer in short order and then back off, which I think is pretty unlikely. He's not likely to extract the concessions that he's asked for. And indeed, I don't think anybody believes that he really thought he would get them in full, although he could get something. The second option is to continue to disrupt Western cohesion, and this all follows, if you like, in the mode of reconnaissance in force. This is conceptual force, not actual force, seeing where success happens and then exploiting in a political, diplomatic sense. And at the same time, continue to destabilize Ukraine with the intent of changing the political leadership, ultimately, if that's possible, all through a mixture of military coercion through massed forces on the border, which is the situation we're faced with, maintaining, very importantly, the readiness actually to strike physically, because Putin is an opportunist, and if there's an opportunity, he will go for it, and to seek to disrupt within Ukraine by political subversion, propaganda. And what we need to watch for in all of this as a signal that he might be actually planning to strike physically in a big way is the buildup of propaganda to his own people, which does not seem to have started in earnest if he were really preparing for an all-out war with Ukraine. So we need to be watching for that. And all the time we need to be bearing in mind deception, which is a classic Soviet and now Russian way of war. A limited incursion is another option to reinforce the Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk, and possibly to start to push the margins. And of course, what he would wish to do if he could, at little cost, is to extend the land dominated by Russians or their surrogates down to create a land corridor with Crimea. That would be a pretty major effort and would certainly cross all sorts of red lines for the West. On the other hand, a limited incursion with regular forces into Donetsk and Luhansk is not a lot different from what he's already been doing for 7 years. And the West has sort of accepted, of course, not at the political level, but in reality, we are in a sort of stable situation, accepting the presence of Russians in that area and really knowing that Russian regular forces are involved, even though it's presented as irregulars and locals. The last option is a full-scale invasion, which I've mentioned, to install a puppet regime. That entirely depends on Putin's reading of the Ukrainian will to resist. What we seem to be picking up in the West is that Ukrainian solidarity is reasonably strong, which would suggest that there would be a strong military resistance, which clearly would be ultimately, we think, overcome because of superior Russian military capability, but then a transition into resistance operations, which could be lengthy, ugly, and painful for Russia. And they're fully aware of the dangers of that. So that is a low probability, but depending on how things go elsewhere, one shouldn't count it out. Ukrainian response, they will maintain a defensive posture. They'll seek to improve that. And there's all sorts of things they can do militarily to make a force-on-force conflict more painful and more difficult for the Russians, particularly in terms of counter-mobility. They will, I suspect, attempt to mobilize the population in terms of popular feeling against what the Russians are doing in terms of coercion, and make it very clear that this resistance would be an inevitable consequence of any incursion into Ukraine beyond the already occupied areas. And of course, they will continue an information campaign directed at the West to enhance support. One would argue an entirely legitimate information campaign. They could choose to take the fight to the Russians. That would be counterproductive at this stage. In the face of an all-out assault, they would fight. I believe they would fight reasonably hard, but they are faced with overwhelming odds, and without doubt, the Russians will find the means to create asymmetry, and they've got all sorts of ways of doing that. So one would expect that at some stage there would be a transition, as I say, to an insurgent guerrilla resistance war. The gloves would be off, and with determination, one suspects the Ukrainians would take the fight back to Mother Russia through terrorism and those sorts of actions, because they would wish to make this as painful as possible and as obvious to the Russian people, who are not being fully informed about what's going on. Could the Russians employ force elsewhere? Yes, they could, but they do know that that NATO stands absolutely solid behind Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. If there is any physical crossing of boundaries and borders, there will be a response. And ultimately, that means escalation to a very dangerous situation, and nobody wants war, notwithstanding some highly irresponsible talk from Russian commanders about creating a nuclear wasteland. None of us want that, least of all the Russians, I suspect. The NATO response, of course, if there is not an incursion into NATO territory, will be political, economic, and diplomatic, and others are probably best placed to talk about that. There will be an inevitable reinforcement of the NATO position because a threat in the East also threatens NATO members. And I suspect there will be a build-up of solidarity within NATO in the face of Russian action in Ukraine. So rather counterproductive in some ways for Mr. Putin. A NATO response, as I say, would only be a military response, an active defensive military response in the event of Article 5 being action, that is Russian aggression against a NATO member. And I think our own information campaign at home needs to educate people about what Article 5 is about, because one has already heard commentary from people who should know better on Radio 4 talking about Article 5 in the context of an attack on Ukraine, where it clearly does not apply. Okay, I think I've had my 5 minutes.
You have indeed, Adrian. Thank you very much indeed. Let me just now quickly look at the Russian angle. We are at a point of maximum confusion. Russia is deploying this enormous force while at the same time repeatedly saying that they're not going to invade. So why has the Kremlin triggered this crisis? What does it want? I think Adrian has indeed pointed us exactly to some of the answers that I will give. Firstly, he's completely right in saying never forget Putin's personal agenda. Putin's been in power for 22 years. He has no option of retiring. He and the people around him have got to keep control of Russia. They would be very vulnerable if they surrendered that control, and everything is seen through that prism. Secondly, Ukraine is Putin's Achilles heel. A great many people in Russia, especially those of Putin's generation, have never really accepted that Ukraine is a foreign country and sovereign and independent. In early 2005, Putin was shaken and humiliated by the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and the hardliners around him told him that the strategy he'd pursued up to that point of being friends with the West, with Bush, Blair, Schroeder, Chirac, with the EU, even with NATO, had failed. And the old Soviet paranoia came out in them. The West were enemies who had dismembered the Soviet Union and were now trying to dismember Russia and steal Ukraine and intrude into Russia's backyard. And Putin is still talking in exactly those terms if you read the transcript of his press conference on the 23rd of December. In 2014, the ouster of Putin's man in Kiev, President Viktor Yanukovych, was a second failure for Putin. He tried to redress the balance by annexing Crimea and by backing separatism in the Donbass and in Lugansk, but that has then been a third failure. 8 years of conflict have not brought Ukraine to its knees. In fact, it's drifted further westward. Now, the number one objective of Russian foreign policy is to regain a power of veto over Ukraine and to keep it within a sphere of influence which embraces all of the states of the former Soviet Union, with the partial exception of the Baltic states, who are now, of course, members of NATO. That doesn't mean rebuilding the USSR. It doesn't mean occupying these countries, but it does mean preventing them from aligning with the West, or indeed in the longer term with China. And it means certainly excluding any possibility that they could ever become members of NATO. And then, as Adrian pointed out, there is a further and more ambitious objective, which is to redesign the security architecture of Europe, to some extent the balance of power in the world in combination with China, in a way which recognizes Russia's power and status. And this is being very directly, rather crudely articulated by Kremlin spokesman. The Kremlin argues that Russia was excluded when it was weak in the 1990s. First Boris Yeltsin, then Putin himself asked to join the club. Not quite to join NATO, though there was speculation about that, but to be at the top table with decision-making powers. And they felt that they'd been kept at arm's length and given a sort of second-class status. Now the Kremlin is not asking, it's demanding. It's demanding that a stronger Russia, which has rebuilt its armed forces since 2007, can no longer be excluded. And it is openly using coercive diplomacy to try to force the Americans and NATO to the table and to try to compel fundamental changes in the security order. And at this moment, Russia is conducting an unprecedented exercise in Belarus, using units which have been moved from the Far East military district for the very first time since the Second World War. It's also conducting, or about to conduct, naval exercises which will involve the entire operational strength of the Russian Navy. It's about 140 ships, and which are not pointing at Ukraine, which is not really a naval country, but they're pointing at the United States and at other NATO members. This is an extreme demonstration of force to NATO. Finally, why is this happening now? Well, it's partly the frustration of getting nowhere for 8 years. The clock is ticking. Putin's gang are aging, and they're not immortal. It's partly because they see a window of opportunity. Looking out from the Kremlin, the West looks weak, divided, and heavily distracted by other issues, by China, by COVID, by various internal domestic battles of the kind that we're seeing in this country and Steve is seeing in the United States. So from the Kremlin's point of view, now is the time to apply maximum pressure, to wave a very, very big stick and to try to crack the resolve of Ukraine and the West. Let me now turn over to Orysia to give us the view from Kiev. Tell us whether Adrian is right in talking about Ukrainian solidarity. Orysia.
Well, thanks very much, Ross. Thanks for UCL for hosting us. And you've set such a stellar example how you can pack so much in such a short period of time. Hard to follow. But I'll speak a bit about the readiness for high-intensity conflict in Ukraine. As I hear all the panelists agree that, I mean, let's hear what Steve has to say, but it's very likely that the pressure specifically on Ukraine will intensify. And I think this kind of combination of attrition and military incursion in the East obviously is very likely. Russia is employing this full spectrum warfare, obviously, where they would like to win first and then go to war. We do know Putin's inspirational thinking in that way. So I think then I will say a few words about the attitude to possible settlement and long-term objectives, the way Kyiv sees it. So this is in Ukraine perceived as the war for independence. As to put it crudely, Russia is viewed as an aggressor state by over 70% of the population. Nationwide, in the East also, around 60% see Russia as an aggressor, and only 12% see NATO as a threat. Just for you to explain how Ukrainians see threats coming. And Russia clearly is viewed as a revisionist power, that in terms of Ukraine wants to turn it into the subjugated buffer zone And here I am not using the word neutral because I don't think Russia is honestly interested in neutral Ukraine. Sometimes we hear unfortunate propositions of Finlandization of Ukraine, where I think Stalin at least respected sovereignty of Finland, whereas Putin clearly in his quasi-historical essays argued for non-agency and non-sovereignty of Ukraine. And it's interesting that Rod mentioned this fear of dismemberment of Russia. And I think deep down in Russian elite, this fear is alive. And this is why Putin believes that expansion is the best strategy to prevent that scenario from happening to Russia. And this is why Putin made that bizarre comment, there's no way for us to retreat, if you remember. I think that is very much pointing to this fear of Russia's crumbling from within. So Ukraine has made its choice, and it's made its choice in 2014, and over those 8 years of war, Putin helped to solidify this choice. Just to give you, statistics, in 2021, those who would vote in the NATO membership referendum, 72% would support Ukraine's membership versus 30% in 2012. And in the southeast of Ukraine, the support is also around 50%. So Ukraine is not really divided on that matter. And that is without any information campaign explaining what NATO is, right? So that's in current circumstances. In case of aggression, Ukrainians are quite sober that they should count on their own strengths and resilience. 56% say we should count on our own forces, armed forces, societal forces. 35% say we should count on EU and NATO. 25% should count on US. So there's a strong readiness to defend, obviously, and resilience that Ukraine built over time, facing Russian aggression every day. 6 ceasefires that were negotiated within Normandy process never held more than a few days. And it was a simmering war throughout all those years. So interestingly enough, Adrian spoke about this resistance and civil insurgency. Indeed, almost 24% of Ukrainians are ready to defend Ukraine with arms. And that is around 16 million people. And that is across age groups. 30% would join volunteer resistance units. So doing all kinds of help to the armed forces. So even Ukrainian parliament yesterday called on the world not to give in to Russian, what they call Russian military blackmail. So you see across society and politics, people say, keep calm and carry on. How much time do I have? Not really much. So on the settlement of Donbass, yesterday we've seen the advisors meeting in Paris. There's not much that came out of that meeting. And honestly, there was an audit of differences, right? It's very important that the conversation keeps ongoing, and it kind of unblocked a little bit this process. But honestly, the compromise that Ukraine is ready to take and what Russia demands is incompatible. Russia wants to reconstitute Ukrainian state into a weak, some kind of federal state with autonomous statelets that would be dysfunctional. Think of Bosnia, for example, right? So honestly, what Ukrainians are ready to compromise, and there is more than 45% ready to compromise along the lines of, for example, transitional justice that would involve foreign judges to review the crimes that were committed in Donbass. For example, peacekeeping mission, UN or well, people are mostly thinking of UN. 63% would support a peacekeeping mission in Donbass. They would be in favor of no lustration for civil servants who participated in the occupying authorities. And there's a slight support to some kind of autonomy, but without the constitutional change, kind of along the lines of decentralization. 33% of people would support it. So what's Ukraine's long-term objective? It's to safely reintegrate Donbass. And I'm using the word safely, which is a big trick, because Ukraine doesn't want to wreck its own state just by incorporating these territories on Russian terms. Ukraine wants to start negotiations on Crimea at some point, and Rod is nodding because I'm looking at long-term objectives. Crimea remains Ukraine's long-term objective. That's why Crimea platform was launched, and it's not going away from the diplomatic agenda. NATO membership is a long-term objective. Right now, it's written in Ukraine's constitution. EU membership is a long-term objective, and there's a strong demand for change in Ukraine. That is why Ukraine will be approximating, will be strengthening its democracy in view of all those challenges. I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Orysia. Steve in California, I hope you can still hear us. How important is all of this to the United States of America?
Yeah, no, thanks very much for including me in this really interesting conversation. I've actually learned quite a bit already. Let me just say this crisis came at kind of an interesting time. As you go back to June and the Geneva meeting between Presidents Biden and Putin, in the 3 or 4 months after that, you saw some positive steps, small steps, but positive steps. So a widening of US-Russian diplomatic contacts. The sides began the strategic stability dialogue on arms control and stability issues, and both sides were saying these are actually fairly constructive. Of course, that's all now been overshadowed by the crisis, and if I had to say in one sentence, what's the US goal? The US seeks to avert a Russian assault on Ukraine, or a new Russian assault on Ukraine, but at the same time is going to hold to certain positions of principle, and I'll come to that. Since December 7, when you had the video conference between the two presidents, the Biden administration has outlined this approach, which is a mixture of deterrence and dissuasion, trying to persuade Russia not to use military action, while also pursuing or offering the chance of dialogue. And so there's been a big stress on 3 baskets of costs to Russia if the Russian military launches a new attack. One would be additional sanctions. They advertise them as far more punishing, and they would not be applied gradually. It would be all in a one big dollop to administer maximum pain. Second, greater military assistance to Ukraine. No one expects the United States or NATO to send forces to Ukraine to fight on Ukraine's behalf, but the United States and other Western countries have indicated that if there is an assault, they would be prepared to provide defensive assistance, arms to help the Ukrainians better defend themselves. And then third, the White House has said that, look, if the Russian military now launches a new assault on Ukraine, there's going to be concern on NATO's eastern flank. And in that case, Washington would be prepared to take steps to send additional forces to the eastern flank. Bear in mind, right now in the Baltic states and in Poland, in each of those, there's only a NATO battle group of about 1,000 to 1,500 troops. And then in Poland, there's an additional 3,000 to 4,000 American troops. The Russians don't like that, but Washington says if they go into Ukraine, there will be increased presence on that eastern flank. And I think what we've now seen in the last week or so is, in fact, Washington is not waiting. So already you are seeing increased measures to provide military assistance to Ukraine, not awaiting for a Russian attack. And also with the alert of American troops, preparations perhaps that there might be a deployment of the NATO response force, again, perhaps even before there would be a Russian assault. Now, it seems to me that the West can impose significant costs on Moscow, but the main cost would be imposed by the Ukrainians. And we've heard that the Ukrainian resistance, both by the military and also perhaps in a partisan conflict. I look at those costs to Russia, and it seems to me they would outweigh any political gain they would hope to achieve. But let me immediately say that in the past, I have not been the best predictor of Vladimir Putin's logic. So I do not exclude that he will use military force. It seems to me that the Russian military is taking steps that would give him options for major military operations. And among the 4 possibilities, it's really hard to say among them. I tend to worry more about the 2 higher end possibilities. And that's in part because this idea that if Russia wants to install a puppet government in Kyiv, it really has to occupy most or all of Ukraine. And I also worry that the Russians seem to be painting themselves into a corner from which military operations may be their only exit. Now, at the same time, the United States has said, look, there's a lot of things in the Russian agreements that are not acceptable. We're not going to forswear further enlargement by NATO, even though there is no enthusiasm within the alliance for putting Ukraine on a membership track. We're not going to remove forces from those countries that joined the alliance after 1997. But the United States, in its verbal responses and then in the written response delivered yesterday, said there are elements of the Russian proposals, questions like arms control, limits on the size and scope of military exercises that could address real security concerns. And there, in fact, is a whole range of confidence building measures, risk reduction and transparency measures that could be useful for both sides. The Russian response, at least initially to the written American response, was that the United States, and I think in the parallel response from NATO, did not address key Russian demands. Now, there still seems to be this possibility of one more US-Russia meeting between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov, but it's fairly clear that the sides' positions are far apart. And I think it gets us back to a question I've really had since December when looking at the Russian demands. Did the Russians put those demands forward in what was an opening bid for what would be a real, genuine give and take negotiation in which both sides leave aside their extreme demands? Or instead, is it really put forward with the idea of seeking Western rejection, which then becomes one more item added to the list of grievances and a pretext for military action? I don't know. I have to say I've become more pessimistic that the Russians will make the wrong choice in this, but we're sort of in a situation now in Washington where the belief is they have framed the choice. They're prepared to respond either way, but now the question is, what will the Kremlin do?
Steve, thank you very much. We're now going to open a short panel discussion, and I'd really like to focus on these four options that we among ourselves have defined and which Adrian ran through. From the most benign end of the spectrum, there is a theoretical possibility, which Steve was just talking about, that you could have a negotiated outcome. The talking has not yet stopped. It hasn't yet got really into a phase of negotiations. There hasn't been yet any movement. You've had an exchange of positions between Russia and the United States and NATO. And one could devise ways in which, over a period of time and a lot of effort, that could be achieved. I set some of them out in a recent paper I wrote for Chatham House with Sir David Manning. So that's one at least theoretical possibility. As you start to move up the scale, we may well find that the Russians maintain the threat of an invasion, but go for what we have called the scenario of attrition, disruption, and destabilization, in which they do maximum disruption of the West. They try to drive wedges within NATO, especially in countries like Germany. They use a lot of disinformation. They use leverage through sympathetic politicians and opinion formers, threats to gas supplies, military maneuvers, all sorts of pressure tactics, cyber attacks perhaps, and simultaneously work very hard on the destabilization of Ukraine, not actually by launching an attack on Ukraine in a military sense, but by using different forms of hybrid warfare, subversion, sabotage, deniable operations, quite a lot of political action to see if they could find a way of ousting President Zelensky and replacing his administration with much more malleable successors, economic pressures, and so on. This is a process that would be very familiar to the Russians, could extend over a long period, and indeed could be at various points interleaved with renewed negotiations as things got worse, and which the Russians would hope to use by ramping up pressure to break the resolve of the West and Ukraine, and perhaps trade off the fact that the Western attention span can often be shorter than the Russian one. When you get into deeper military territory, we identified a third option, which we called Novorossiya, which would be a limited incursion, but it would be a military incursion, raising the intensity of the conflict in the east and south of Ukraine, and could possibly extend as far as the Black Sea coast and as far as Odessa. So this would turn what is a low intensity conflict into a much higher intensity conflict, and would encounter significant Ukrainian armed resistance with casualties on both sides, and would trigger sanctions. but without giving Russia control over the whole of Ukraine. It would give it a chunk of Ukraine, but without the level of control that I think Putin aims for. And then the most extreme option is what we call Vichy, in which you would invade Ukraine, you would go to Kiev and beyond, and you would install a puppet government. And that really is very high risk for Russia, because occupying large countries, and Ukraine is bigger than France and has 42 million people in it that don't want to be occupied, is something that the Russians should have learned from Afghanistan. We had our own example in Iraq. It's very expensive, very difficult, and in the long run tends to be very unsuccessful. And it would trigger the most severe form of Western reaction. So proceeding from that background, can I just ask the panel whether any of them think that Russia is likely to go for the option that seems to be presented a lot in our media at the moment, of a major invasion, because there's a lot of pictures of tanks around the place, and it's become a sort of binary question: will they invade or will they not invade? But full-scale occupation of Ukraine, do any of the panel think this is likely?
Actually, let me say, I would look at options 3 and 4, and I do have to say that I worry about them, in the sense that, you know, if the Russians wanted a negotiated settlement on the terms they now have, they've known for more than 2 weeks what the United States and NATO are prepared to negotiate on. You know, they have not taken that yes for an answer, and it seems every time that they hear a response, either verbally or now that they have it in writing, their response is to point to the fact that the West ignored our key security demands. So I think option 1 is probably very unlikely at the moment. Option number 2 may be where it comes down. And I guess in one sense, I can see that option, but I do wonder that in whatever dialogue that continues with the West, at some point, the Russians are going to have to confront the fact that every time they raise the question, those items that Vladimir Putin has said are his key demands, this was reiterated by Dmitry Medvedev earlier today, are being rejected. And at some point, I just wonder if they feel that they have now painted themselves into such a corner that they cannot accept that rejection, and they have to do something which would go beyond option 2. That's why I worry about options 3 and 4.
Adrian pointed to the importance of public opinion in backing military action. There are quite a lot of indications that the Russian public would react very negatively to a full-scale war against Ukraine, not only because it would be body bags going back to Russia in much larger numbers, but also because killing Ukrainians is not actually that popular. Ukrainians are fellow Slavs who Putin has declared to be effectively Russians, not foreigners. Adrian and Orysia, do you think that Russian public opinion would be one of the factors that the Putin regime would really weigh up in that scenario? Adrian, can I go to you first?
Yeah, I mean, Orysia, funnily enough, is probably a better place to answer that question. But I'm absolutely sure that Russian public opinion is central to where this goes. And I come back to my original point, which is that the most important thing for Putin is to hold on to Russian support, Russian public support. And indeed, I said when I was Deputy Supreme Allied Commander that the time to worry about Mr. Putin would be when his political support was starting to wane. And in that sense, perhaps that could explain some of what's going on now. But I think the primary consideration for Mr. Putin in terms of escalating to all-out military action, funnily enough, is probably not, in the end, what the West are going to do. You know, the analysis of how well sanctions would go is a bit varied. There's an energy crunch at the moment, which puts the Russians in a lot better position. And they're a lot better prepared for Western sanctions than they were in 2014. And it wouldn't be unpainful to the West. In fact, it would be quite hard for us in some ways. So what really matters to them, probably slightly more, and this might be a bit of a controversial comment, is the Ukrainian response itself. And as I say, the danger of being enmeshed in a terrible guerrilla war, taking heavy casualties, body bags going back, not just in the initial fight, which obviously would incur serious casualties on both sides, but ultimately is likely to go Russia's way simply because of the numbers game. But you know, that drawn out, painful process, which to a certain extent Russia has already seen in the Donbass, that is not a good scenario. But military action remains a danger, because if they go for the most likely option that we've talked about as being most likely, this continued coercion and pressure, whilst remaining militarily ready to strike when the opportunity presents itself, they've got the opportunity to take the time to change public opinion, or to seek to make the Russian population more ready for the arrival of body bags by selling the greater interest of Russia and the vital nature of enhancing their security buffer zone against an aggressive West, and selling the idea that actually cozying up to Russia is better for the Ukrainian people. I'm not sure how easy the latter will be. And as I say, Orysia is much better able to talk to that, I guess.
Well, over to you, Orysia.
Well, fascinating. It's interesting, the search for inhibitors, right? How can we prevent the worst case scenario? And we're looking for different, like you say, the motivation, right, of the opponent. It's very interesting. But I think here I would argue we have to be very careful not to apply the same template of Western politics and what matters for democracies and autocracies. And I think here Russia could play very much a kind of a zero-sum game where just humiliating, destroying, being a disruptor, to put it mildly, is already a win, even if they cannot exactly achieve very structured objectives in the way they want to see European security. I think it's interesting on the information space as one of the pointers. I mean, there's been, I think yesterday, an FT article actually talking exactly how they are ramping up disinformation inside Russia. I've seen public opinion in Russia that says that who is to blame for this escalation around Ukraine? And of course, Russians put the blame on NATO, on US. This has been already preparing the public opinion. In my view, if Russians escalate militarily, they will present it to Russian public as they are actually fighting destroying NATO infrastructure in Ukraine, liberating Slavic brothers from American influence. They've been spinning for the last, since Zelensky was elected, him as the puppet of American government. They've discounted him as the worthy side to negotiate. So I think we're already seeing that, and there's also a sudden dehumanization of Ukraine as a non-state, all the incapable, in wrong hands countries. So, even anti-Semitic statements about President Zelensky because of his origin. So all of this is already happening. I mean, they can dial it up. And in those scenarios that we've been discussing, I think, honestly, we are already in phase 2. Attrition, disruption, destabilization. This is already going on. They can dial it up again more. And if I look at the Russian levers, and here I'm talking about Ukraine, I'm not talking about how they may want to project threat to NATO, because that's another theater of war, I think. And we see them, projecting that threat so far beyond Ukraine, possibly in the Sweden, possibly Ireland, possibly, you know, Black Sea, right? Because that's also NATO periphery on the beyond Ukraine. I look at what is left in their arsenal. Use of pro-Russian forces and political parties very weak. Energy very weak. Ukraine is not buying any Russian gas, buying a bit of coal for heating, but not much. Capacity to radicalize population, yes, they could, but I think Ukrainians are clear about what Russia does, so that's to a limited degree. Economic coercion, not so much. What is remaining is cyber. That is very dangerous. I think they could target civilian infrastructure. Active measures, there's been a lot of bomb threats. They are still deploying it. So finally, only very hard power tools such as military are really there to coerce Ukraine into what they would like to see. And just to tell you, control of the Donbass, it's not enough. They need Kiev to agree on the new constitution of Ukrainian state, this new settlement. That's why just in Donbass, it's not enough for them to advance.
Thank you, Orysia. Now, I know Steve has got to leave very soon. So, Steve, I'd like to give you the last word in this panel discussion before you go. We've got 373 people listening and 24 people have filed questions, so I want to allow time to address that. Steve, before you go, just one question for you. China appears to be giving some important passive support to Russia's actions. In particular, it has, I think, facilitated the transfer of troops from the far east of Russia, facing China, to Belarus, a very, very long distance, 9,500 kilometers. It's given some political support. Clearly, Putin and Xi talk to each other. Do you think that the Chinese are quietly encouraging this so that they and the Russians can achieve a shift in the balance of power globally at a time when the United States is dealing with a lot of issues and Europe is dealing with a lot of issues, and neither are in their strongest format?
No, I certainly don't exclude that, although I have talked to a China expert out here at Stanford, and that person's view was that China has its own timetable. You know, because the question is raised, is this now a time for China to move on Taiwan? And the assessment was China has its own timetable. It's not going to be affected by what's going on now between Russia and the West. And I think there's perhaps a downside here for China, which is it does appear that there's a fairly good degree of unity between the United States and Europe in handling Russia, to the extent that there is a strong Western response to Russia. You know, that's also not a bad message to China. But I'd like to just make one comment, just to go back and second what was said. In terms of the Russian calculation of the costs of a military operation into Ukraine, I think we've heard exactly the two main factors. There are Western penalties, yes. The main factor is going to be, how does it play with the Russian population? I don't think Vladimir Putin cares much about dead Russian soldiers. I think he cares very much, though, about how Russian soldiers coming home in body bags affects the Russian public view. And then the second question is, how hard do the Russians judge the Ukrainians will resist? And let me throw one thing out here from the perspective of how I see the Kremlin. I worry sometimes that the Kremlin does not understand Ukraine that well. If Russia did, and Russia's goal, and I agree, is to try to bring Ukraine back into the Russian orbit, back in Russian sphere of influence, would you really have chosen the policy of the last 8 years, which has done more than anything since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West? And so I do worry that, you know, there may be a certain lack of understanding there at the top, and there may be miscalculations made, which is why I tend to be a bit more worried about the likelihood of the two larger options. And on that happy note, I'm afraid I must leave.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for joining us. And on your very last point, I agree entirely. I constantly hear from people in Moscow who interact with the Kremlin. that almost nobody in the Kremlin really seems to understand the way that Ukraine is these days. And there is a risk of misconception there. And of course, counterfactually, you can say that if Russia had used the enormous soft power that it had in Ukraine, rather than going hard, as it has done over now many years, they could have achieved everything they want, or pretty well everything they want, at least 85% of it, but they don't actually understand soft power. Now, we've still got 364 people on this call, 22 questions. So at this point, I'm going to turn over to Abby Turner, who is going to group some questions and fire them at us. So Abby, it's over to you, and it's goodbye to Steve Pifer.
Thanks, guys. So I'll start with 3 questions. So Tim asks, what role will Belarus likely play in this crisis? Dina asks, if Russia invades Ukraine, would the cost of oil and gas go up? And Roger asks, does the panel see any role for Erdogan's Turkey to act as a mediator in the Ukraine crisis?
Right. Not easy questions. Can I just take the middle one, which is the easy one? The cost of gas will obviously go up, but one has to remember, and it has already gone up, that gas is a two-edged weapon for Russia. If Russia cuts off gas supplies to Europe, this is already being anticipated to an extent by the Europeans who are looking for extra supplies from Qatar and the United States. But gas is the most valuable export commodity that Russia has. Now, it's got enough money in the bank that it can do without that for a while. But as with any form of sanctions, it hurts the sanctioner. And the Europeans, it would be tough, it would be expensive, but they could manage. On the role of Belarus, Lukashenko is a Bolshevik sort of chap. He's a pretty autocratic dictator, and he actually likes Belarusian sovereignty. He has never set out to be Russia's enemy, but he and Putin over the years have had a pretty fractious relationship. But he had to call the Russians in to help him after the demonstrations against him after his rigged election 2 years ago. And Putin has now got him by the short and curlies, and is able to deploy a force into Belarus, which is now exercising with the Belarusian army, which numbers about 45,000, I think. I doubt if the Russians would necessarily want large numbers of Belarusians going into Ukraine with them. I think that's an open question, and they probably don't need them. But I think they've got Belarus where they want it, which means that they have a degree of control over Belarus. They don't have to occupy the country because it's sort of in their pockets now. And that's what they'd love to have in Ukraine. Question of Erdogan, or indeed the other issues. Adrian, I don't know if you have a view on that.
Well, I was going to come back on Belarus, and it's a really interesting question because one might ask oneself whether this, in fact, is as much about Belarus as it is about Ukraine. And I rather suspect it is, because what Mr. Putin wishes to do as the sort of secondary objective that I mentioned and you've mentioned, Roderic, apart from sort of keeping himself in power, is to increase his sphere of influence. He's succeeded in doing that to a degree, to a high degree, as you've indicated in Belarus. But he's now got several tens of thousands of troops, a good chunk of which are now deployed on Belarusian soil. The question is, for how long and under what terms? And I rather suspect that this one might run for a long time anyway. In terms of his pressure on Ukraine, I believe he will want to leave ready forces in place for quite a time, and that this might have some way to run, because he's got to wait for the other elements of his campaign to really start delivering opportunities. And he never knows when those opportunities might come, because of course, much depends on our reaction. A misstep here or a misstep there might create the perfect opportunity for Mr. Putin to go for it. So from his point of view, having ready forces retained in place for as long as possible looks quite attractive. And even if the troops aren't kept there, keeping parks of equipment sustained and ready to go might be an advantage. And having them in Belarus applies a sort of leverage and a guarantee of future Belarusian good behavior from Putin's point of view, which I think is probably part of the overall plan anyway, because everything that Putin does is multifaceted and he's looking in all sorts of different directions. So it's a really interesting question. I mean, the immediate role of Belarus right now is a forming up place, a provider of a line of communications, a place for logistics to build up, a place for rehearsals, and a launch pad if an invasion is required from Putin's point of view. But as I say, I think this goes further than that. On the cost of oil and gas, I think other speakers are better qualified to talk to that one, but it would seem to me to be inevitable that there would be a hike in prices. And is there a role for Erdogan? Well, I'd come back on one thing, which is, you know, NATO's policy with respect to Russia and any other opponents is a combination of deterrence and dialogue. And what we have to create for Mr. Putin now is an opportunity to climb down from this without losing face. But actually, it mustn't be a climb down. It's absolutely vital that it is not a climb down, because he's not going to climb down. He needs a ladder to climb up out of the hole he's dug himself. And who knows, Mr. Erdogan, who has been something of a friend to Russia, despite being a NATO member, may just have a role in this. That's probably much more in your line of business, Roddy, as a diplomat than it is mine.
Thank you very much. Orysia, I'm going to miss you out on this round and bring you in on the next, so we can take another group of questions, if you will forgive me for that behavior.
Perfect.
Abby, give us the next group.
Sure. So Kevin asks, the West is threatening economic sanctions. Do the opinions of the wealthy Russian elite who might be affected by sanctions have any sway over Putin? Michael asks, will Russia also veto Sweden or Finland joining NATO? And if they do, is he ready to invade them as well? And Roger asks, does the panel consider that there is a relationship between what the Chinese might do to Taiwan and what the Russians might do to Ukraine?
Right. Orysia, any comments on those?
Right. While we are discussing here, Zoom, on the homepage of Financial Times, it says China backs Russia's security concerns in crisis with West over Ukraine. Voila, I have not read this article yet, but clearly it's very good we bring in China into this conversation, because since 2014, China is watching carefully the price Russia pays for the annexation of Crimea. Of course, China is very strong on territorial integrity, and clearly, at the time of voting at the UN Security Council, abstained, did not vote against or vetoed the declaration on Crimea. But I think it's very important for the West to exactly deter Russia from further territorial encroachment on Ukraine, because that would embolden China. I also agree that China is not such a disruptive power as Russia is, and not a revanchist power, and feels actually it has more time on its hands than Russia. So it's not taking rushed decisions. And I would imagine it's a better strategist than Vladimir Putin, who seems to be achieving opposite results by his moves. That's what I can say. And Taiwan, actually viewed from Kiev, there's a lot of interest in how Taiwan is building resilience to Chinese pressures and being able to sustain a democratic society. Because honestly, I believe the best remedy against this kind of incursion, coercion, malign interference is strong democracy at home. And this is why it brings me also to Finland, where Finland at that time in the conflict with the USSR was able to maintain national unity through a democratic governance. And I do hope Ukrainian leadership learns from that experience of strong democracy. And I believe that Russia will be threatening NATO periphery, as I said, in other places than just Ukraine. And this is where Belarus comes very handy as another pressure point directly on NATO, not just on Ukraine. Although, of course, it's useful in two directions. Belarus borders Kiev Oblast, which is very close, you know, in terms of distance, and a good landing point from the military perspective. I will leave Russian elite to Roderic.
Okay, well, in very short order, I think that sanctioning the Russian elite as such, you need to be careful who you're talking about. An awful lot of the Russian elite are not actually close to Putin or don't have any great influence on him. But there are some people around Putin, many of whom are already sanctioned, from whom one must presume he takes advice. I don't think, they may well justify being sanctioned, but we shouldn't believe that this is going to cause him to change course. As for Sweden and Finland, I will turn to Adrian. Clearly, there's no question of Russia vetoing their membership because Russia doesn't have a veto. But I think the question is, how would Russia react if Finland and Sweden move forward towards NATO membership? What do you think, Adrian?
Well, clearly Russia would react very badly indeed, but I don't think that they would go as far as invading, because this would be incredibly dangerous. And anyway, it would be quite difficult for the Russians to do that without making incursions onto NATO territory in the Baltic states. It's not a hugely practical option. But
and it wouldn't really achieve one of Russia's key objectives anyway. Okay, Abby, let's move on to the next group. We can probably get two more groups in if we're quick.
Great. So John asks, can Putin extract himself from his provocation without loss of face? If necessary, how can the West facilitate such an outcome? Eugenie, can the cyber attacks by Russia on Ukraine help the conquest of Ukraine by getting confidential information on the government of spreading propaganda benefiting the invasion? And Sandy asks, what about public opinion in the West, and particularly the Western countries of Europe? Is there any evidence of support for Western governments taking a strong line?
Right. To a degree, Adrian has addressed the question of Putin extracting himself without loss of face, in that he needs a ladder, as Adrian put it, to climb up out of the hole that he's dug himself into which he's in danger of digging deeper. On public opinion in Europe, I think this is really important because the biggest deterrent that the West has is Western unity, which over the years has been quite fractured, but this crisis has brought it together up to this point. The Russians will be working extremely hard by using disinformation, public opinion, friends in different European countries, every means they can to try to prise Western countries apart. They're rather pleased that the British have marginalized themselves and lost an awful lot of their influence in Europe, as they have done. The Germans have got a new coalition, which is still, fairly shaky. Germany is an absolutely key country that the Russians will work on. And then they will try to play games with the French, who are sort of ideally looking for a European solution rather than a NATO solution. So I think public opinion in Europe is really important. And the problem with public opinion is that its attention span can be quite limited. It can also be scared. And at the moment, they're trying to scare it. And they are trying to get pressure on Western politicians to make concessions to avoid this really frightening spectre of a major war on European soil on a scale not seen since the Second World War. So that is already happening. Adrian, other points you want to pick up here?
Well, only on the point about Putin extracting himself without loss of face, and I think there are some options here. If we seriously got into a conversation about a renewal of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which would have advantages for both Russia and NATO, and incidentally could be a way of us agreeing to remove certain forces from areas close to the Russian borders, of course, if it were mirrored. That could be presented by Putin as something of a victory that he had achieved through the coercive measures that he's taken. And we should be quite happy in a way to let him take the credit for that. Obviously, it leaves him in power, but it takes the heat out of the crisis. Similarly, some sort of new security construct with respect to the interface between Russia and the West, and a return of processes which were well known to us. I was for a time an aviator during the Cold War, and there were procedures there to avoid misunderstandings, which aren't actually still in place and haven't been rebuilt. We could do things like that. And also, Ukraine might voluntarily make a declaration about not joining Ukraine within a given time, provided that we returned to notions of the sort of security guarantees that were handed out by the Russians, the Americans, and the British, incidentally, when the Soviet Union broke up, about Ukrainian sovereignty.
For those who are interested, the paper I wrote for Chatham House that was put out a couple of days ago tried to look in some detail at the question of whether there could be a settlement that didn't breach our principles, that stood up for the independence of Ukraine, but at the same time had something in it for Russia. Theoretically, that I think exists. That's not to say that it is something that's going to attract Mr. Putin at this stage, because I think he wants to keep upping the ante before he gets to it. Orysia, quick points from you, and then we'll take the final round of questions.
Right. I just want to say that all of those assumptions are very valid, and I think it's great to brainstorm them. What are these possibilities? But I think they will be only viable if Putin decides that the conflict with the West is not in his benefit. Right. So far, he's building this fortress Russia very much in the antagonism with the West. This is the ethos of Putin, is the alternative Russian civilization. It's that defense of the traditional values. And that's what kept him in power, and kind of that annexation of Crimea that gave him so much juicy public opinion support. So maybe we will sense the changing winds in Moscow, and then could use these diplomatic tools that could help Russia to climb up. I think it's a good one, to climb up the ladder with some kind of pride and dignity. But honestly, I think it's a midterm option, the way I see it. But I just yes. quickly on the narratives, and I think we run Ukraine Forum in Chatham House, and we produce quite a lot of what has changed in Ukraine in the last 8 years. But this, of course, doesn't reach as massive public opinion. And the positive role that EU, UK, the US played in that change, because Russia portrays Ukraine in this basket case, completely corrupt country. A lot of citizens in the West have very negative view of Ukraine. So they ask themselves, why should we stand up to the defense of Ukraine if they're all corrupt? And I think this is where, events like that, and also materials from UCL, from Chatham House come handy. Of course, there's much more that has to be done in building that public opinion. There's not enough at this point.
Right. Abby, last round of questions.
So Alex asks, what role, if any, does the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, play in this situation? Natalie asks, would an exclusion from SWIFT be realistic? What consequences would it have? And Valentina asks, could Russia be doing this to see how NATO and other governments react? Is it possible this is part of a larger plan?
Right. CSTO, Adrian, very much your territory, part of a larger plan as well?
Well, I think that the CSTO is to an extent, even if it's not presented in that way, playing a role in the cooperation between Belarus and Russia. and that would seem to be the limit at this time. But one also has to be aware that Putin is looking in all directions. And if he can present a situation where Belarus has gained advantage from its support to Russia, if he can present that case to other nations around Russia that are in the CSTO, that may be an advantage. But I think to an extent it's already playing, but it's not declared as a CSTO type of activity.
Orysia.
Well, I would like to say that, you know, Russia has created these also regional integration projects, you know, from Eurasian Economic Union to CSTO. And quite often they play a bit of a smoke screen function, whereas it's not really a equal of equals. The club, the way we see European Union, this is clear where Russia dominates, and you know, organizations like that and their possible enlargement, and that's why we are looking here at Russia that is trying to get more of these buffer zones or influence zones. Could be a legacy also project for Putin, right? He is also thinking what happens next for him. So the discussion today and especially the role of Ukraine is key for probably Putin's legacy, in a way of having some kind of supranational union where he could preside as a president. That is not excluded from, in my view, from a possibility. But just to finish, I think it's why what happens today in Ukraine matters in a wider terms, because it matters for the future of Russia. I genuinely believe when people are saying that, you know, Ukraine is the backyard of Russia, I say Ukraine is the back door to Russia. So think about what it means for the future of European security if Russia moves towards a more peaceful, more democratic society. And I believe it's possible. Ukraine's example shows that even under such coercion and pressure, it's possible, despite of all the traumas of the 20th century. And that's why I think helping Ukraine, we help Russia and we help European security.
Thank you. Just quick comments from me on those three questions. CSTO is really a Russian fig leaf that legitimizes their involvement in Kazakhstan the other day and in Belarus, but it's not, of course, a democratic organization like NATO. So I think it's of fairly marginal importance. It's just Russia plus countries that Russia can order about. SWIFT, there are serious technical problems about cutting off SWIFT, partly to do with the complicated way in which SWIFT is actually governed. And clearly these have not been ironed out yet, and there are differences across the Atlantic over whether or not SWIFT can be and should be cut off, and the disruption that this would cause to the global financial system. It's a fairly extreme weapon, and it may not be a usable one. Finally, is this part of a larger plan? I think the Russians have made it clear that it is. As I said earlier, I think their first objective is to have control of Ukraine and their sphere of influence within the former Soviet Union. But clearly they are testing out the West. They are testing out the Biden administration. They're testing out the solidity of NATO and the solidarity of Europe at a time when, as I have said before, we're all a bit divided and we're not at our strongest. And in a very obvious, very direct way, Russia is demanding a change in the security order in Europe, the security architecture of Europe. That is part of the larger plan. And as I was speculating before Steve left, that may be part of an even larger plan into which the Chinese and the Russians both buy, of using this moment to actually make a shift in the balance of power in the world. Russia and China, both countries rather short of friends. China now effectively a superpower. Russia an ex-superpower that likes to think it's a superpower and can't bear the thought that it isn't. Teaming up, although really they're fearful of each other and they're not terribly friendly to each other on a personal level, and Russia certainly sees China as a long-term strategic threat to Russia. But teaming up in what one well-known author has called an axis of convenience, to try to tilt the balance between them and the West, because the Americans are at the moment saying they need to roll the Chinese back. The Europeans are increasingly nervous about Chinese influence. The Chinese are extending the Belt and Road Initiative. They are extending influence through Africa. And, you know, if you are a Russian strategic thinker, you might think now is the time to give this a push and to try to go back in a very 19th century way to, you know, it's power that rules, and we have got more power than we had, and we want more gains from it. At that point, I think I need to conclude. I'm almost bang on time, and I had dire threats from University College London if I overran. So we are now going to end these proceedings. I am very grateful to the 380 people who joined in this meeting. I apologize profusely to those more than 20 people whose questions we were not able to reach. We did our best. I've also been asked to tell you that at 6 p.m. next Thursday, the 3rd of February, UCL will be running another seminar, the Political Science Department. You can now see the advertisement on your screen for Professor Jan Ikut, who's talking about his book on the profit paradox, rising profits and bad consequences. And finally, before we all leave, I would like to offer warm thanks to everyone who's troubled to join the seminar, to the UCL Political Science Department, and especially to Professor Robert Hazel and to Abby Turner, and above all, to General Sir Adrian Bradshaw, to Orysia Lutsevych, and in absentia to Steven Pifer for their time and their very considerable expertise. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.